Take two. Now I can hear myself. All right, so you again are with KPCA LP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM, and you can find us online at kpca.fm, kpca at pca.tv via email, and via snail mail at P.O. Box 2806, Petaluma 94953. So you are here with DG the 30-something for this installment of the State of the Union. I always like to remind people that are Facebook streaming online on Facebook that this is a radio show. And so I welcome your questions, but I cannot swear, so you cannot swear. And those are the ground rules. I moved it once. We're all learning as we go here. Okay, so again, today's show, we are going to be talking about the racial identity of policy. This is probably one of the hardest shows that I've personally had to prepare for because it's a very tough topic, and I'm not a lawyer, and so I had to do quite a bit of preparation for the show. And so again, you can watch live. If you're tuning in on audio and you are on Facebook, you can actually watch the live video on the DG the 30-something page. And that's where you can ask questions and interact with the page. I have everything right here in front of me, so I will be answering questions. So I'm going to start. I felt that after the occurrences of Charlottesville, it was really important to not only continue that conversation, but start to cover some of the information and the facts that happened. And again, this is a nonpartisan show, policy-based show, so I always try to provide information in a properly framed way for people to understand and process on their own. At the end, you'll hear my analysis. But I wanted to start with some facts. So Charlottesville, I didn't feel the need to explain what happened in Charlottesville. If you don't know what happened in Charlottesville, please just open a new browser at this moment and Google it. But it was a protest. 35 people were injured. I saw between 14 and 35. This kind of shows us how media is really hard to find a good answer about what was really going on there. But as far as the highest number I saw was 35 people were injured and one was dead in the car crash with a person that plowed through the counter protest. And I lead with that because I think it's a very important place to start. So now we can go a little bit into why the protest was happening. So the protest originally was framed based on the removal of the Confederate General E. Lee's statue in Charlottesville. And a right-wing blogger, his name is Jason Kessler, he actually told the South Bend Tribune, which is the local newspaper, I found it right from the local source, it was that, in fact, the protest was about an anti-white climate within the Western world and the need for white people to have advocacy like other groups do. Just want to leave that with you for a second, because that's a very interesting statement by a prominent leader in this movement, that in fact this was about white people having to have the same voice as other advocacy groups in this country. So I want to get a little bit into the significance of the Confederate statues, because what happened after is there was a call for a removal of several of the statues, and the main pushback was that was part of the culture of the South, and that was part of the identity of the South. So I just want to give you a little historical context of when those statues went up, in fact. So it's funny. My first note when I was that I'm sorry you lost the war, Mr. Lee, and in effect he surrendered his army to Grant on April 9th, 1865, and then retracted and said that different action had to be taken to address the issues that were being addressed in the Civil War, and that's been really used and messaged in a way that Lee was never for the Civil War. It was for Southern identity and Southern rights, and it wasn't about slavery. And so that you see that really, really rampant in a lot of the white supremacy and people that are pushing this as a Southern identity, and these statues being used as a Southern identity instead of actually looking at the facts of what they have been used for. So the truth about the statues. So Mike Daly did the page, it's a media source online. They did an actually great video that actually went through the history of the resurrection of a lot of the Confederate statues. And what was most thrilling about it was that a historian actually noticed, and the name of the video was "Why Did Confederate Statues Fall So Easily?" I'll make sure after the show to share that video onto this page so that people can see the actual source of the information. But what was most interesting to me is that the largest influx of Confederate statues was during the Jim Crow era. And again, I'm not going to get totally into the history of everything. I feel if you're watching, like, please, look into these issues. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please look into them. I don't have a semester's worth of a college class, so I have an hour. So most of the statues were, there's an influx of Confederate statues in the Jim Crow era at the turn of the century, which was the era of segregation and the idea of separate but equal. And I'm going to come back to that idea. The other huge influx of Confederate statues was in the 1960s, which would be during the Civil Rights Movement. And this is fact, like you can see it on the graphs, that those are the two times that most of the Confederate statues came up. So claiming that it was part of Southern identity is a little, it's starting to falter with those facts, because they didn't all come up during or right after the Civil War. They came up in very staggered times, and they seem to have a very marked reason for being put up in the context of oppression, in my opinion, of why they're up. He also makes note of, the reason it's called "Why Do They Fall So Easily" is because they were actually not made out of substantial materials. So physically they would fall because there was a company at the time that was mass producing Confederate statues. And so, and that was a whole thing. I also think a really important part is that the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was a group at the time, paid if cities and towns couldn't afford to resurrect their own statues. And I would like to note that the United Daughters of the Confederacy also promoted removal of Black history from textbooks and promoted that the war was based on states' rights, not on slavery. And, I'll leave that for now because I think there's going to be a parallel later. But I think that the important context here is that one of the main groups that was helping fund the resurrection of these statues was also trying at the same time to remove Black history from textbooks. And I think I mentioned this in my last radio show, but I actually didn't even have a flag, an African map in the reel in my high school class. And I graduated in 2004. And I thought we had a very selective history, even in my own high school class. So this is really an ongoing issue about what's history and what's not history. And there's been a lot of success in removing and having select history in schools. And that's a big, big issue. And so, again, there's this huge push that everything is about Southern identity and history and not about slavery. And so, in my opinion, we've been fed about 120 years worth of propaganda at face value. And, it's a very complex issue, but this is really fed to, the top of my notes on this show says the racial identity of policy. I'm still trying to figure out if that makes sense, but in my mind it makes sense because I think that there is not only an identity, but an implication of a lot of policy development based on race and ethnicity in this country. And it's a conversation that hasn't really been had for a long time. And that's really unfortunate because I think this conversation really needs to be had, which is why I took on this topic today. And so for those of you that don't follow me on Facebook, I actually did, in response to the protests in Charlottesville, I went and saw the movie Detroit because I felt that it was the only way to kind of counter what was going on from a distance. And when I was in the movie Detroit, it was actually really interesting because people left. There's very few people in the film. There's only 3 showings in my local town, which is considered to be relatively progressive. And it was almost as though this idea of selective history was right there. Because the story depicted in that movie is based on a true story. And it was almost as though people couldn't handle true history and instead had a very selective idea of what history looked like. So I found that to be a super huge issue, and I think that we're going to come back to this idea. I have it kind of bolded on the side, but this whole idea of separate but equal, I think, is a huge issue. And again, those who are tuning in for the first time, if you notice me looking away, I'm looking at my Facebook page because that's where people can interact and ask questions. So I just want to make sure that I'm being cognizant of people that might be interacting there. So, okay. Alrighty, so it might seem like a strange parallel, but I actually find it to be a very interesting parallel. So I'm going to switch gears. Since I don't have any questions explicitly about Charlottesville yet, I want to get into DACA, the DACA repeal. This is something, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know all the legalese of this, so I always, ask people. I literally, crammed this information in my brain in the last 48 hours, so if there's people that have other information, please share it. I'm trying to stick to the facts of it, and then you'll get kind of my overall analysis at the end. But if you find that there's something that it doesn't quite seem right, please let me know. And then please correct me. All the information here that I have is based on the United States government immigration website. So that's my source, unless otherwise stated. And so for those who may not know, DACA stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. In short, it's very often called the Dreamers Program. That's a very kind of common name for it, and to be noted. So I wanted to go through the actual criteria to become a DACA recipient. I know that this issue has been highly politicized, really in the last 2 years, but in the last couple months, because of what's occurred, it's become very politicized. So I wanted to just talk about the sheer requirements that it takes to be a recipient. So I'm just going to go through those really quick because I always find that in a lot of my work with my background in public health, people have a very skewed view of how easy or hard it is to get services from the United States government, because it's really not easy. So first off, the first criteria is you have to arrive before the age of 16. You have to have lived continuously in the United States in July of 2007. You have to be under 31 as of June 2012. You have never had lawful immigration status, or status has expired before June 2012. You have to be in high school or in track to be high school or GAD or a veteran of the armed services or in the armed services, you cannot have, this is one I found to be incredibly interesting. No felonies. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. No significant misdemeanors, or you cannot have 3 misdemeanors. So I'm not quite sure what significant misdemeanor means. I feel like felony misdemeanor is a distinction. A significant misdemeanor is not quite a distinction. Or if you've had 3, then you don't qualify. And then you had to be physically present in the United States on June 2012. And to top this off, currently you have to have proof of all those things. So imagine as a child of an immigrant who was brought here, finding proof of all of those, all that documentation. It currently costs $465. And I think there's about 5 or 6 forms you had to fill out. And of course, all the information on the U.S. immigration website's in English. So people have to go through this process. So now I want to get into kind of it's interesting because they're calling it the phase out of DACA, which I don't see a phase out. I see the memorandum and the executive order that was passed in 2012 is no longer valid. So there's no plans for phase out as far as I can see. And I looked all through the immigration website. I would love to see a plan for phase out. But currently right now, all I've seen is a removal of the original executive order. So a little bit of history. In 2014, DAPA was introduced, which is Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents. It was shortened to DAPA. And the idea here, I remember hearing a radio show about it when the original lawsuit started, which I'll get into. But the idea was that we had these children in the United States that qualified for DACA, but their parents were under risk of being deported. And that's a huge issue. You know, how do you have minors in a country? And there's a lot of famous people that have now come out and talked about this, wrote books about this, about how, you know, their parents got deported when they were lawful residents or they were under DACA, and you know, that's a huge issue. That's like putting policy before implementation, which I'm a huge proponent of putting implementation before policy, because unfortunately it seems that for the most part policy is not well thought out. It's very knee-jerk, and it doesn't actually address real life situations. Like, would you want a small child to have lawful residence potentially and have their parent deported? Then what? Then what happens? Then they're in another system in the United States, which is really pricey and really ineffective. You know, but these things aren't thought about, in my opinion, before the policy goes through. So in November of 2014, it was proposed that DACA would be expanded to include coverage for parents. And it also increased eligibility for DACA recipients as well. So I think this is a lesser known fact, and I actually didn't know the entire history of this. And most people I've talked to since I've done this research also don't know. So right after that expansion was proposed, the state of Texas and a constituency sued the U.S. government, saying that it was unlawful to put this expansion through. And it conflicted with the discretion of Congress. And I think it was the Fifth Circuit of Appeals. It was a tie. It was 4-4, and so the injunction was upheld, which basically meant that the program expansion was frozen. In June of 2017, basically, in short, like removing the legal side of it, there was an agreement that it would remain in the judiciary system, so that when the new president came in, there could possibly be movement. Well, when the new president came in, basically Texas and its constituency threatened that they would also not only include DAPA into the lawsuit, but they were also going to include the DACA expansion or a DACA in general, to the lawsuit if it wasn't rescinded. And so now we're here. September 4th, 2017, the memorandum was published. And I encourage people to read it. It's really, I found it really interesting as I went through the entire history. And then kind of at the end, it was like, well, I have no choice, basically. It's my obligation to therefore remove this decision in June 2012. And if you go to the immigration website, they've already made updates about the fact they're not taking new applications. And it's very unclear because there is no plan for removal, transition. There's no plan. As far as someone sent me a plan. There's no plan. They're basically just saying that memorandum, that executive order that was passed in June 2012 is no longer there. And again, I find this to be a very hasty decision. There's no plan of action. There's no plan of transition. It's over now. And it leaves us all hanging. And I found out yesterday that the state of California is now suing the federal government as well against the decision. And we have a lot of lawyers here, so I'm sure they can figure it out. I'm not one of them, but the state of California, I know it started with the UC system, and now the state of California is actually suing the U.S. government for the counter argument that it was unlawful that they rescinded it in that way. And so just some other quick facts before I kind of get into my commentary, because we're like halfway through here, is facts about DACA. And again, these are from Mike Daly. So 750,000 recipients currently. 91% are employed. There's an estimated $433 billion loss in GDP over 10 years if they were removed from the country. The average age is 22, and 17% are pursuing advanced degrees. And it's funny because I feel like we shouldn't even have to justify this, because for me it's only relevant if we could compare it to current residents and where their statistics are at. In relativity. But I also think that it's really interesting because when you talk about 750,000 people, we're not talking about millions and millions of people. We're talking about 750,000 people that are protected under this law. And so this really gets to the crux of the issue. I've presented a ton of facts. I try to do my homework because I was not an expert on this by any means, and I really had to look into all of it myself in order to get a grasp on it. And I think there's an interesting connection here between what occurred in Charlottesville and what's been occurring in the news. I will not claim that racism or policy affecting certain ethnic and racial groups is a new idea. Because I don't think it's a new idea. I think that it's something that's being realized again. I think it was realized 60 years ago. Is that where we're at? It was realized 60 years ago. And since then, we had successes, but it hasn't really been addressed. And, my main opinion about it is that everything that's being pushed out is blaming Trump. Like, it's Trump's fault. It's Trump. Can we just come up, let me ask my face, can we come up with a different name? Because I'm tired of hearing about it. I'm tired of it all being on Trump. This issue is about Congress. The DACA issue is about Congress. It's because Congress failed to take action back when the original law, it's not that they didn't fail to take action, they couldn't come to agreement when the original law was put before them. And so an executive order was put into place. And it's so funny because everyone's calling out Obama like, oh, you put this executive order and it's unlawful. How many executive orders do we currently have? With no say in Congress. And that's really upsetting. So this is Congress's job. This is Congress's job. I think this is really a time where people do need to make sure, and I've said it once, I'll say it again, we really truly are in a bubble in California, and we need to make sure that if our representatives at large in this country are not representing our needs and our wishes, which they showed with the reform of the Affordable Care Act. I think that I don't have the statistics in front of me, but as far as everything I've seen, most Americans don't want to see that go away. They might want it changed, but they don't want it to go away. And still, our representatives are acting in in a capacity that is outside, in my opinion, of what people are really looking for. And that is a huge issue. Now, we're currently in this situation. We are in this current governmental arrangement. And I've had people ask me, it's because it's so hard. It's such a complex issue. And everyone say, what can we do? What's the answer? And there is no one answer to the problem. So, I mean, just going back to the Confederate statues in Charlottesville, I think that this lack of understanding of true history is part of our issue. I remember I said last night when I got into a conversation with someone about DACA, I said, you can't go to a group of seemingly racist people or closed-minded people, however you want to characterize it. I don't like to label people, but if you're a racist, you're racist. You can't go to someone and say, don't be racist anymore. Here's a ton of information, just don't be racist anymore. That's not how it works. We actually have to address the operational infrastructure of our country. The reason that DACA was at face, I'm not saying it was the core reason, but at face was because of how our judiciary branch works. This was made again, and this is one of the major connections, the parallels I found, is that, again, it was made about states' rights. Just like the Civil War was tried to be made about states' rights. Oh, this isn't about keeping people out of the country. It's not about slavery. It's not about oppression. It's about states' rights. That's what it's about. And I think this blanket that's being pulled over our head is really significant in all the messaging. So, and I think that's a huge issue. We have the triad. We have the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the judiciary system for a reason. The Supreme Court, in order to keep everything in order, and I find it relatively devastating. It's not the first time that our judicial system failed us. Again, because, and for me, it's more about the messaging. And I think that this distinction has to be made, because again, as I noted before, Mike Daly noted, it's been 120 years of propaganda about this being about states' rights and it not being about the country as a whole. And so I feel like it's kind of talking out both sides of your mouth, to use a euphemism, where you have one intention, but then you're saying another. And saying, well, we uphold state rights. And I'm proud of California for saying, well, we have ours too then. If you're going to play that game, we have ours too. And I think the distinction really needs to be made. And I think that, and I believe in states' right. I believe in the individual choice. But the problem is a lot of the funding is attached to the federal government. So we have this disconnect between states' rights and where all the money's coming from. And this is a huge question with healthcare reform, is that California was obviously very much against a lot of the decisions that were trying to be made, but they get their funding from the federal government. So how do we mitigate that issue? Well, that issue needs to be mitigated because technically, in my opinion, was always like the federal government couldn't actually deny an RFP response by proper procurement based on the political climate in a state. That shouldn't be legal. That actually should not be compliant. But as we've seen, and Trump has openly come out and said he's going to defund California, that's not going to happen because he can't do that. However, I think that distinction is really important. And this isn't about states' rights. This really is not about state rights. I have this, I actually published some pretty scathing videos after Charlottesville happened on my personal Facebook page. A lot of swear words, can't publish them here. So, because my main commentary, and again, I always reiterate, this is a nonpartisan show, and I think this is a nonpartisan issue. This is a country issue. It's not a partisan issue. These people are not patriots. And they are... I was thinking earlier today, I think a lot about these things. I prep so much, and then I find that, I start having different conversations with myself around the issues the day of. And I was brought back to how totalitarianism is created. And I've been talking about it probably for the last 7 or 8 years, about there's key signs. If you actually study all the countries that fell under totalitarian rule, which there's a lot of them, We always think of Hitler, but there was many, many dictators. There was many, many situations of totalitarianism in this world throughout history. Currently, and they're currently there. But some of the marked things are this idea of cleansing and removing academics and people that are speaking out against the current situation. I think it was Chile that actually had one of the most remarkable... I wish my law and society teacher was on here. I think it was Chile, though, that talked about how they literally forced all of their high-level academics to leave the country because they didn't want them reaching people, right? They didn't want them sharing this kind of information that I'm sharing with you right now. They didn't want that. And I think that what has happened is that media has polarized this country so much that people aren't getting actual information. And we have this kind of facade of freedom of speech and freedom of press, but our press is not speaking a free voice. It's speaking a very biased, very agendized voice. And that is a huge issue because if people were really speaking out on the, within the context they could, I feel that we'd be in a very different climate. And the last election just showed the product of... Let's go back to that. I think 120 years of propaganda, I think that's a great number. It could be more. But I think that is a huge issue. We've been fed a lot of media that is polarizing. And I'd like to say that the popular media is now, after the last election, trying to remedy some of it. But I still can't watch the news. It's so bang, bang, flash, flash. This is happening. Be scared. Do this. Yada, yada, yada. Like, that's too much to deal with. There's not a whole lot of fact-giving. And I understand why, because even me, I've been in this field for a long time, and I actually had to read the memorandum that rescinded DACA probably 10 to 15 times to even just get the gist of what was being said. And I think that that's one of the solutions to someone that asked me yesterday was that smart people need to start helping the masses understand what all of this really means. And there's a lot of predictions about what's going to happen with DACA. I don't know what's going to happen because all I can say is that there's no plan. And that's never good. That's never good. And all my years of government not having a plan is a real bad plan. So, that's a really unfortunate thing. And so right now, I think the most immediate solution to this issue is Congress doing something. It's in their hands. The whole reason that Texas and its constituency, and I feel bad calling out Texas because I have friends in Texas, but it was Texas v. U.S. government, so I'm sorry. Your state did this. But where was I going with that? Totally lost my train of thought. But I think that the reason that they had this handhold is because Congress wouldn't take action. And the scary thing right now is actually if you follow what government is doing right now is that Congress is not taking major action, but I feel like they're taking micro action. And a lot of that micro action might actually lead to the quicker demise of a lot of major policy than we think. So it's kind of how we've watched certain states dismantle women's rights. Let's use that as an example because I'm very familiar with that. So women's reproductive rights. We have states that make certain aspects of it illegal or say, well, state-sponsored insurance is not going to pay for it. Well, that's a micro choice that most people might think, well, it's just one little thing. But all those little things add to a very big thing. A very, very big thing. So taking away a woman's right seemingly to birth control then takes away their ability for family planning. And so I feel like we're in the same situation here where we'll call them microaggressions of a passive aggressive. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist either, but heck, it's kind of what it seems like. They're microaggressions where, like I said, it started with the travel ban. That was and it wasn't a super microaggression. It was a relatively macroaggression, but that was racially charged. There was no reason for that. There was actually no facts that backed that decision. And I think it's the same with the DACA repeal. I think that it's this whole idea that it's somehow impacting the state. 750,000 people across the United States are affecting each individual state so much that they can't possibly deal with it. And, you know, states like Texas, Arizona, they're not known for being the most liberal, especially in Florida, in border areas. And I think it makes sense. You know, what I'm most curious about actually is how the people of Texas feel about their taxpayer money going towards suing the United States government. I would really like to know that. And I would really like to know how much that cost and how much money that took out of your economy. Now, I guess you can ask the same question for California. Well, what's it going to cost for the state of California to fight the U.S. government? But I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the general constituency agrees with that. But I always just wonder, did the general constituency in Texas understand? Did they not only agree with it, and I have the same question for California. I don't know if people understand either, but do the people in Texas understand that their taxpayer money went towards suing the U.S. government to potentially send 750,000 people out of the country? And I don't have, what's the population of the United States? Someone help me out here. It's a lot, it's a lot larger than that. I've had that statistic in my past radio shows. And so I think that really gets into this issue of this long-term oppression of minorities. And I brought up two different but somewhat parallel issues. I brought up Charlottesville, which addresses a different type of issue because a lot of the people affected were not immigrants. They were actually brought to this country, which is different. But I also feel like the two issues are being addressed in the same way. There's a lot of systematic oppression. And again, you know, what happened in Charlottesville, and, you know, I just keep circling back to the movie Detroit, which highlights the torture and murder and the turmoil that went on in Detroit, and probably when a lot of these Confederate statues were being resurrected around the country. No wonder people were mad. And I just go back to that and have to think, how can Jason Kessler claim that the world is an anti-white climate? The Western world is an anti-white climate. I mean, that's a super, I don't want to say ignorant, but that's like one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. First off, you don't understand the general population of the world, or even the Western world. It's kind of ridiculous. I actually maybe would have bought it more if you just said the world, but saying that it's anti-white in the Western world is pretty ridiculous. And everyone could potentially, getting a call, but I'm not answering calls. So everyone could potentially bring up all the statistics that show the disparities in this country. And I'm not going to do that now. Again, it's a very complex issue, and I encourage people to really look into the facts. That's what I try to present, the facts of the issue, not just the media or the popular opinion of the issue. But it was a very interesting time. And I think we're in a very interesting time. And what I will say is that it is true that the Trump era, again, I would like to give it another name because I don't even like saying that name, but the Trump era has really introduced a different level of violence towards people of color. Very reminiscent of between 120 and 60 years ago. Because somehow now it's become okay. And I think it's because of these microaggressions. It's because of these micro policy changes that make people feel that it's okay. And I've gone into my other radio shows about how people were clearly so fed up. White America, and this is not, people got on me after the election about saying that look at the voter statistics. That's who voted for Trump. White America. White men and their wives. That's who voted. Sorry. It's a fact. You can look it up. And it's just created this weird power source that I think an 8-year-old was lynched yesterday. Like, what kind of a world do we live in? And it's scary, but I want to take a step back and have people not get too fearful and too up in arms about this, because there are really things we can do. I think in the immediate, this is Congress's problem with DACA. With regard to DACA, Congress needs to take action, period. So I don't care where you are in the country. This is the one time that I really, not the one time, not the only time, but this is the time to seriously contact your representatives every single day if you have to, and call your friends that are in states that are potentially for this, because that's why we're here, is because of the distinction of state rights instead of congressional obligation. And Congress has been getting away with murder for years. Like I said, 120, between 60 and 120 years. We'll give them that range. They've been getting away with that. And if they do not take action, 2018 is an election year. So get rid of them. Get rid of them. Let's get rid of these people. If they're not representing your district, get rid of them. And so one of my biggest, let's call it a preach, one of my biggest preaches right now is that people need to vote in these intermediary elections because they have very low voter turnout. When a president is being elected, it's much higher. It's still not good, but it's much higher. So please help people register, help them vote. And I always hear, the major complaint I hear is that, it's hard for people to get to the polls. You can be a permanent absentee. You can get it mailed to your house weeks before the election. You can get help on interpreting the ballot if necessary. There's a lot of resources around. And I think that there's no reason, and I have to call it my own generation, because my generation, the votership, especially in the intermediate elections, is awful. It's awful. And I think if the general public's going to take this states' rights call, then we shall take advantage of that and really pay attention to who our local representatives are. Not just state, but city, county, and state, because they are who are going to help push this agenda. And I also got into an online conversation I think is really important to bring up, is the fact that I'm unwilling to continue to thank my representatives because we have a huge issue. And it's not that I don't appreciate them taking their time, but I think we've simply thanked them for too long. And I think it's time that we ask them hard questions. And someone asked me, like, well, what's the underlying issue? And I said, well, this is a culture issue within our political sphere. This is a deep-rooted political issue. So if you're a Democrat, a party that's been in complete disorganization and disagreement for years, which is why a lot of these congressional issues don't go through, is because no one can agree on anything ever. Because it's always like, do what you want to do, be your own person. That lack of cohesion has been a huge issue, and I want to personally see, and now the Republican Party is seeing it too. They're seeing a significant lack of cohesion. The difference is that their agenda is still being pushed forward. So they've got it figured out somehow, but it's because they have the majority in representation, and they have a Republican president, which is hilarious. I always like to go back that Trump was always a moderate. He was never a Republican. If you haven't seen The Manchurian Candidate, you should watch it. But this is on Congress, and this is on making sure that there's people in office that actually represent our opinions and our needs, and they just haven't done it for a long time. Between the House and the Senate, they just have not actually been representing most of the states in an accurate and factual way, and that's a huge problem. And so the more ongoing solution, I would say, is getting new people into office. So if the people do not act in a way that you find to be great, then it's time to get new people in office. And I think most people will agree that believe in progress in this country realize that we have to get new people into office, new voices, in my opinion, younger people that actually represent the largest voter bloc that still don't vote. I'll stress that over and over. We are the largest voter bloc, and we are not voting. So I think that's the two major issues. And I do believe, and I know everyone really wanted me to make a really strong commentary on the ethnic and racial side of things. And I have a lot of commentary on that. I have a lot of commentary. And I do think that this is racially and ethnically driven. I do think that by decreasing diversity and decreasing knowledge, people are controlled. We see that in a lot of the totalitarian nations that have been developed throughout history, because it's kind of this idea that if you aren't learning from other people or other countries or other cultures, then you can be kind of siloed into one culture. And in my opinion, the American culture actually is all these different cultures in sync. I don't believe in it being a melting pot. I don't believe in distinct assimilation. I don't believe in any of that. So that's what I'm saying. But I do believe that the American culture is all these cultures coming together. I think a lot of people have a hard time because they don't have a huge connection to their individual ethnicity or racial background, which I find to be a problem because they don't have, because we see in public health that a protective factor is people actually living, a protective factor towards health is people actually living in an enclave, so in an area where they have high cultural density, and then also living closer to their cultures. So we see Asian Americans, that's a huge distinction. I realize that. I would like to see that information disaggregated. But we see that they have some of the longest life expectancy rates, and a lot of the predictions have to do with them holding to their own personal culture. When I was in my public health program, I got a lot of kickback on this. I still do, actually, anytime I mention it. But I want to mention it anyway, because that's what I'm here for. I actually did a research study on, I think it was Argentina. As Argentina became more Americanized, the people became more unhealthy. Because it was based on the food, actually, quite a bit. It was based on the food and lifestyle. Because fast food was integrated into the culture, and then this very quick, like, have to go, 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 go. You don't sit down, you don't have a meal, you don't enjoy each other's company, you don't pace yourself. A lot of that started to become lost. And we see that in a lot of other countries. I'm going to just say that. You can look up the stats. I've gotten in arguments with people that are in public health for the last 30 years over this. But it's just a fact. And I'm not going to say that the United States doesn't have its own culture, because I think the United States culture is all of these cultures coming together and providing this really amazing experience. Now, it's not the same in every state. So every state has a different culture. And I would actually love to pick the brain of someone that is pro-appeal of DACA. I've seen a lot of very moderate responses saying that it's just time for a phase out. That's not an answer. One, it's not an answer. Because there's no plan for a phase out. There's no plan. So just saying, it's just time. It's just time now. It's time to get rid of the program. It's time to send an average of 22-year-old out of the country. When is that ever rational? That's not rational. So, again, 750,000 people. So a lot of people start going into all the legislation and how it worked. And it's like, okay, but you're not really defending your point at all. I want to know what is going on in the mind of the state of Texas, where they felt the need to spend, it's got to be over $1 million to sue the state of California, the United States government, to rescind a law that only protected 750,000 people. Like, what actually is going on there? Now, again, I think the deep-rooted, it's racial, it's cleansing, it's isolationism, it's the claim I'm sure they make is that it's costing their state a ton of money, which is probably not factual. Just like people always claim that immigrants are draining a lot of our social services, but if you actually looked into what it took to get a lot of our social services, you know that wasn't true, but people still really believe that. So in my last 5 minutes, I actually didn't get any questions, so that is totally okay, but I do want to go in closing. I think that, I can never really stray away from where I fall in the media and propaganda realm, because I think that this is a huge driver of all of this. I think that a misunderstanding of the true intentions and the lack of obligation, for example, of the state of Texas and its constituency to actually vocalize why they're doing this. They made it legal, and our system allowed them to make it legal and allowed it to go through. But what's really going on there? And do the state of Texas, and I didn't look into all the constituent states, but what's going on there? What's in your mindset? And I haven't been able to find a clear answer that wasn't surely racist, or the flip side, which is very neutral and basically just saying it's time for a phase out. And it's so funny because I always think of this episode of South Park, just a shout out to the South Park watchers out there, but there's this line, they took our jobs. And I feel like that's an often common rhetoric, that the immigrants are taking American jobs, which is not true, actually, because in fact, I think it was today they announced that there's more job openings than there has been in a decade or something like that in the United States. So claiming that there's a lack of jobs is kind of silly. There might be a lack of jobs that people want to do, but that's a different statement than there's a lack of jobs in the United States. So I'm actually going to end with a question. That is what I'm going to do. I'm going to end with a question because I don't have an answer. What can we do to properly spread facts and information to the general public? What can we do? I spend my day-to-day trying to train agencies how to best reach their populations, but how can we, as a collective, as a country, make sure that people understand the facts? Because even some of the smartest people I know, and these very intense activists, and I respect everything you're doing, but do you actually even understand the facts? And if you do understand the facts, how are you sharing them? And I think that's where we're at. We need to get down to the facts. Protesting is great. Marching is great. It's a great way to show your support. It's a great way to find your community. But I still find there to be a lack of fact in all that. There's a lack of understanding of the law. And when there's a lack of understanding of the law, then people are really hard-pressed to interpret the law. I gave a very abridged version of my understanding of the law here. And a lot of people recommend I talk to lawyers. And I didn't actually want to do that because I wanted to be able to process the information as a non-lawyer and try to share it as well as I could as a non-attorney, because I think that's where we're at. How do we shift information? How do we shift the media? How do we start giving people facts? I've always said it, legislation's hard, law is hard to understand, but that doesn't mean that it can't be packaged for people to understand. I had to go to the U.S. government website, and I looked all through. I just Googled DACA. I just Googled it just to see what would come up. And I had to actually go to the U.S. government website to get the facts of what was really going on and what was really proposed. And that disconnect is scary. That disconnect is scary because, I was able in an hour to break down bullet points of the requirements of DACA, which I think is a very important thing to consider. And then to also go through the history of it. And why is that being missed? That's my question. Why are people overlooking the facts and driving right towards the media? And I think that's a really poor, I don't usually leave with a question, but I think that's a question that needs to be answered. How do we remedy that gap? How do we get the facts out there? Social media was created for people to connect and communicate. We have this amazing tool that reaches people all over the world. But how do we get people to understand the facts and have the critical thinking skills to process these facts and develop a true opinion for them? I think that's the huge issue. That is a complex issue. There's no one answer. That is not an easy thing to remedy, but I think that's what we're up against. that's the only conclusion I can really come to with all of this, because I literally don't even understand what people are thinking right now. So on that note, again, I'm going to close out. You are watching State of the Union with DG the 30-something. I'm here the first Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. Again, my show is a nonpartisan policy-based show, and you are listening to me on KPCA-LP, Petaluma, California, 103.3 FM. You can find us online anywhere in the world at kpca.fm. And our email is kpca@pca.tv. And our snail mail is P.O. Box 2806, Petaluma, 94953. I hope you enjoyed.